Mantova wakes slowly, like warm dough rising beneath a cotton cloth. The mist clings low along Via del Herb, and even the pigeons seem reluctant to break the peace of morning. I am already behind my stool before the bells of Sant' Andrea strike. 6. My name is Maria Ferranti, but the children call me Nonna Maria dei Dolci. I've sold sweets in this piazza for over 40 years, Turin wrapped in wax paper, amaretti that crumble like childhood secrets, and my Sprissolona, the crumbly almond cake that has won 2 regional ribbons, though I never hang them. I don't do this for prizes. Each morning, I unlock my stall with the same hands that once trembled to open doors. Now they're steady, a little curved with age, yes, but confident, quick. I brush off the flour from yesterday's shift, wipe down the glass display, and set out the cannoli with their tips kissed in chocolate. The city stirs. Churchgoers pass with folded umbrellas. Vendors greet one another with grunts or nods. I nod back. These are my people, men and women who know what it means to build something with tired fingers and prayers you whisper into soup pots. A little girl with cinnamon-colored curls skips to the edge of my counter. Her mother hurries to catch up. Scusa, Signora Maria. The woman pants. She saw the amaretti and refused to keep walking. The girl's fingers clutch the counter, eyes wide as she studies the rows of sugar-dusted pastries. Your daughter has good taste, I say, lifting one amaretti into a wax pouch. But she doesn't have €1, the mother begins, reaching into her purse. It's her first memory of today, I say, handing the cookie to the girl. Let it be sweet. The mother looks at me as if I've handed her a jewel. I see something behind her eyes of fatigue I recognize. Not all exhaustion comes from work. Some comes from silence. They leave, and I return to slicing Turin into perfect portions, careful not to crack the edges. I think of how many things I've learned to handle delicately, how many names I've chosen not to speak aloud. Young man in a pressed coat approaches next. He looks around 30, with the face of someone who has just learned how fragile life really is. He waits until no one else is near before speaking. My Nonna used to bring me here. When I was small, he says, eyes flickering. You gave me biscotti. Once, after I fell and cried into my gelato. I tried to recall his face in a smaller version, but there have been so many. Did it help? I asked. He smiles, shy. I stopped crying. That day, I give him 2 biscotti without charge. By midday, the stall is busy. Children laugh. Tourists ask in broken Italian for that crunchy thing with almonds, and older folks stop to talk about the heat. I answer with the warmth expected of a grandmother. No one suspects what my voice once cost me. Every gesture I make, every knot I tie in a paper bag, every ciao, bella, is something I earned. I didn't always know how to make things sweet. The first time I touched almond flour, I was already past 14, taken in by a neighbor after everything crumbled. She taught me how to beat eggs with sugar until my arm ached. I had no money, no name I wanted to keep. But in her kitchen something began to rise in me, like the cakes we set in the oven with whispered prayers. Now, at 71, I am known. Not famous, not grand, but known. There's something sacred in that. At 2 o'clock, I close the stall for my short afternoon break. I walk to the fountain at the center of the square, where pigeons bathe like dignitaries in slow motion. I sit, with a small thermos of espresso and a slice of my own cake, never the full piece, just a sliver. Across the square, a young woman with a baby in a sling passes, cradling the infant's head as she looks both ways. Her hand on the child's back is small, unsure, protective, and yet she walks with urgency. That small gesture, the way her fingers press gently, without possession, undoes me. I close my eyes and breathe. When I open them again, the sunlight has shifted. It touches the yellow stones of the piazza with gold, glinting off shop windows and catching in the laces of old cafe chairs. It glows against the front of my stall, my yellow dress floral and faded shimmers slightly in its warmth. A young boy runs past me, laughing, arms outstretched like a bird. He doesn't know it, that he is the reason I stayed. I fold my thermos back into my bag and return to the stall. Before reopening the glass display, I pause. My reflection catches in the glass a bent woman with an elegant silver bun, warm olive skin, and eyes that have seen too much. Still, I smile. Not for the reflection, but for what it doesn't show. The child I used to be wouldn't recognize me now. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it means I made it. There's a reason I never sell lemon pastries. I've tried, once or twice, over the years. Lemon crostata, lemon ricotta tarts, even lemon glazed. Biscotti. They always looked fine, but I could never finish a slice. The smell sharp, clean, just slightly bitter pulls me too far back. To a house I didn't speak of aloud. I was born in 1954, in a yellow house at the end of Via del Voci. The street name means voices, but ours was the only house on. The block that seemed to swallow sound instead of letting it rise. From the outside, it looked proud. Crisp shutters, vines climbing neatly around the windows, and a little garden in the front with white pebbles arranged like lace. Mama swept that garden twice a day, even when it didn't need it. Cleanliness shows character, she would say, her voice clipped, precise. Inside, things were clean too. Too clean. Not a single speck of dust on the wooden floor. Not a wrinkle on the embroidered doilies Mama crocheted for every surface. But there was no warmth in that order. Only tension, like everything had been polished until the shine burned your eyes. We were a family of 4 back then. My father, Giuseppe, worked at the municipal office. He carried himself like a man who expected applause after every sentence. His mustache was trimmed to a perfect line, and his boots always gleamed. He didn't walk. He arrived. My mother, Elena, was a former schoolteacher who had given up her post after marrying. The home is the woman's classroom, she once said with a smile that never reached her eyes. She dressed modestly, spoke quietly, and moved like a shadow that wanted nothing more than to disappear at the first sign of trouble. And then there was Francesca, 16, when I was only 8. Beautiful, sharp, always watching. She had a way of speaking to adults that made them laugh and then forget she was in the room. To me, she was a mystery. I knew she kept secrets. I just didn't know they were mine too. It began on my birthday. We were seated at the kitchen table. Giuseppe had just finished a long monologue about why Mantova was failing because of weak leadership and lazy youth. I had a new dress, blue with white polka dots, that Mama had sewn late at night, when no one was supposed to hear the machine humming. A rare kindness. Giuseppe passed me a package wrapped in brown paper. For the birthday girl, he said with a smirk. Inside was a small wooden broom, polished, delicate, child-sized. I didn't understand the joke, but I laughed because he wanted me to. Now you can help your mother keep things in order, he said, sipping his wine. Every girl needs to learn her duties. I nodded and placed the broom carefully beside my chair. I had learned long ago that rejection was dangerous, even in the form of laughter. Later that night, Mama left for church. It was the first Friday of the month, a vigil she never missed. She wore her dark veil and told me to be good. Before kissing my cheek without looking at me, Francesca was already gone, likely at one of her mysterious choir practices. Giuseppe called me downstairs to the basement. Help me with something, he said. The basement smelled of damp stone and lemon polish. He'd cleaned that day. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering. When I stepped onto the cold floor, he was waiting by the workbench. He didn't speak for a moment, just looked at me, then at the broom in my hands. "Set it down," he said. His voice was calm, measured. I did. "Take off your dress." I stared at him. I thought he was joking. I hoped he was. "Do it now." I remember the silence. I remember the sound of the bulb's hum. I remember the lump in my throat that wouldn't go down, no matter how hard I swallowed. And I remember obeying. What happened that night doesn't need repeating. Some horrors gain nothing by being described. But I will say this. That was the night the yellow house changed from a home to a mausoleum. I washed the blood from my thighs in silence, biting my tongue not to scream. When Mama came home, I was already in bed. She opened my door, looked in, and said nothing. She must have seen my wide, sleepless eyes. That she only said, "You have school tomorrow. Go to sleep." That was her way. Neat, controlled, as if nothing messy could possibly live in a house that cleaned out after that night. The broom began appearing on my bed. Sometimes once a week, sometimes more. Always polished. Always waiting. Giuseppe would give no warning. Just a knock on the door. "Bring the broom," he'd say. Each time, my voice disappeared a little more. I stopped singing in school. I stopped laughing. I stopped asking questions. Francesca would look at me across the dinner table with an expression I didn't understand. Pity? Resignation? Guilt? She never said a word. And Mama. She started leaving the house earlier, staying at church longer. Her prayers grew louder, but her eyes never met mine again. That summer, lemon trees bloomed in the back garden. Giuseppe was proud of them. "Took me 5 years to get the soil right," he told anyone who would listen. He brought the fruit into the house and left them on the counter. The smell filled every corner, bright and sharp. It clung to the walls. It sank into the curtains. And I began to associate that smell with pain. To this day, I can't stand lemon. One night, I stood in front of the broom with scissors in my hand. I wanted to destroy it. I wanted to burn it, to bury it, to snap it over my knee. But I didn't, because I knew what would follow. Instead, I wrapped it in a towel and shoved it into the bottom of the linen closet. Mama found it the next day. She said nothing. She just took it out, polished it again, and returned it to my bed. Was when I understood. She wasn't looking away. She was helping him. I used to think silence was safety. When I was a child, I believed if I kept still enough, quiet enough, if I learned how to fold myself into the corners of rooms and hold my breath at the right time, I could disappear. I didn't know then that silence wasn't protection. It was complicity. The kind carved into you by people who tell you that speaking will cost you everything. At 9, I had already become fluent in that language. In our yellow house, every sound carried weight. The creak of the floorboard outside my door meant Giuseppe was home. The clink of cutlery meant Elena was keeping up appearances. The high laugh of Francesca drifting down the hall, that meant money had come through. I learned to hear things others didn't want to acknowledge. But no one heard me, because I didn't speak. I couldn't. Not yet. It was around that age when I began hiding in the linen closet. Not out of fear, that came later, but out of strategy. It was the only place in the house where the light switch was broken, and the shadows were thick enough to cover me. I'd wedge myself between folded sheets, holding my knees, and press my back into the wall, hoping the lavender scent would choke back the nausea in my stomach. It became a ritual. I'd escape there after school, before Giuseppe returned from work, before Elena remembered I needed correcting, before the broom made its next appearance. Sometimes I'd pretend the closet was a train car, carrying me away to some distant city, where nobody knew my name or my silence. Rome, maybe. Or even farther Bologna, where people said the air smelled like books and rain. But the train never moved. It was just a closet in a house where everyone pretended not to know the truth. Francesca started dressing differently when I was 9. Shorter skirts, brighter lipstick. She was out more often, always coming home with cash folded tightly in her coat pocket. Elena never asked questions, or if she did, it was behind closed doors, and the answers came with silence. I once saw a man hand Francesca a bill outside our garden gate. She took it and turned her face away when she climbed the stairs. That night, she didn't eat dinner. She just sat there, hollow, fork scraping her plate while Giuseppe talked politics, and Elena smoothed the napkin across her lap like it mattered. I didn't understand everything then, but I knew enough to see that whatever was being done to me was only one part of a larger pattern. Enough to know that silence was passed down like recipes. That was the first time I hated my sister. Not because she was part of it, but because she survived it by becoming what they wanted. And I couldn't do the same. I couldn't vanish like she did. I was too small, too clumsy, too noticeable when I cried at school. I became the girl in the last row. Always cold, always wrapped in long sleeves, even in April. I didn't speak unless called on. Even then, I mumbled. The teachers chalked it up to shyness. I let them. I'd stare at the chalkboard and pretend the letters were people I could talk to. I gave them names. I told them everything. The only person who saw past it was Professor Lucia. She was new that year, barely older than Francesca. She had curly dark hair she never pinned up properly, and glasses that slid down her nose no matter how many times she pushed them back up. Her voice was soft, but not timid. She spoke like she meant what she said. But one morning, after I flinched, when she reached to collect my workbook, she didn't say anything. But the next day, she left a note in my book. If you ever need someone to listen, I'm here. It was written in blue ink, just beneath the grammar corrections. I stared at that line for hours. Read it more than I read the lesson. I didn't respond. Not then. But I kept the page folded in my coat pocket for months, until the ink bled from rain. That note stayed with me longer than any bruise. 10. The punishments grew less predictable. The broom was replaced at times with other tools, whatever was near. A belt, a copper spoon, even his bare hands. Once, Giuseppe slammed the edge of a cabinet door against my shin, because I dropped a plate. I couldn't walk properly for days. Elena told the neighbors I'd tripped in the garden. The way she said it, even I started to wonder if it was true. Gaslighting, they call it now. Back then, it was just the air I breathed. I tried to run away once. It was a Monday. Elena had gone to confession, and Giuseppe was late. I packed a paper bag with a change of clothes, a biscuit from the pantry, and the note from Professor Lucia. I slipped out the back gate, barefoot, and started down Via del Voci. I made it as far as the olive tree by the canal. That's where I froze. What if I got lost? What if someone found me and sent me home? What if Elena told everyone I was a liar? Worse, what if no one believed me? I stood under that tree for nearly an hour before turning around. When I came back, the broom was already waiting on my bed. As if he'd known. As if the house itself had betrayed me. He didn't beat me that night. He just smiled. "You'll always come back," he said, and turned off the light. He wasn't wrong. Not yet. Years later, people would ask why I never married. Why I never had children. I always smiled and gave some excuse: too busy, too independent, too picky. But the truth is this: I was afraid I'd become my mother, that I would see something I couldn't bear, and instead of stopping it, I'd shut the door and pretend not to hear the cries. That the silence would become hereditary. Something I passed on with lullabies. That fear kept me alone for most of my life. But it also saved me. Because it meant I never stopped listening for the voices of children no one else heard. By 11. I had stopped looking people in the eye. I had learned that directness invited questions, and questions led to answers I wasn't allowed to give. At school, I perfected the art of disappearing without ever leaving the room, sitting still, eyes low, speaking only when called on, and even then with half my voice. The other girls whispered about me behind their hands. I was the odd one, the quiet one, the one who smelled faintly of lemon and antiseptic. I didn't mind. Being ignored was safer than being noticed. But some days, I wanted to scream. Not for help. Just to hear what my voice sounded like outside my head. There was a hallway in our house that absorbed sound. It connected the back bedroom to the pantry, where Mama kept glass jars lined in rows like soldiers. It was narrow, dim, and smelled of mildew in winter. When I passed through it, even my footsteps vanished. No echo, no breath, just the soft whisper of cotton against plaster. That hallway became my measure of how real I was. If I could hear myself walk, maybe I still existed. If I couldn't, maybe I had finally succeeded in becoming what everyone wanted: silent, invisible, obedient. Sometimes I stood in that hallway for minutes, hands pressed against the cool wall, listening to the sound of my own stillness. I told myself if I was quiet enough, maybe I could dissolve right there. Francesca left for good the spring. I turned 12. No farewell. No goodbye hug. Just a morning where her bed remained made and the smell of her perfume was already fading from the shared room. Giuseppe claimed she was staying with a distant cousin in Modena to help with a family business. Elena repeated the story without inflection, folding napkins like she was reciting scripture. But I knew it was a lie. The week before, I'd overheard a man's voice from the front room. Low, gruff, unfamiliar. I'd seen Elena pass him a sealed envelope with trembling fingers. Francesca didn't meet my eyes at dinner that night. Her fork clinked against her plate. She didn't eat a bite, and the next morning she was gone. Bed stayed empty for years. No one dared touch her things. Her name became a ghost that moved silently through the house, never spoken but always present. I stopped asking, because I knew the answer would be another silence. At school, Professor Lucia had begun watching me more closely. She never pushed, but she didn't ignore me either. When I came to class with a bruise across my wrist, she didn't ask where it came from. She just placed a small box of plasters on my desk before the bell rang. Once, during a writing assignment, she asked us to describe a place where we feel safe. I stared at the blank paper for the entire period. I had no such place. When she collected the papers, I handed her the empty sheet. Sometimes, she said softly, the safest place isn't one we've found yet, but it's worth looking. I didn't know if she meant the closet, the hallway, or the corner of the church where I sometimes sat alone on Sundays. But her words sat with me longer than anything else I'd heard that year. The abuse had changed by then. Less rage, more ritual. Giuseppe no longer needed excuses. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam doors. He simply expected a glance, a gesture. The broom, now worn at the handle, placed beside my bed like an invitation I couldn't decline. What became worse, in many ways, was Elena. She had grown colder. She no longer asked if I had brushed my teeth or finished my homework. Instead, she managed the details around the horror with quiet efficiency, laundering sheets before the sun rose, bringing ointment for bruises, drawing the curtains tighter than needed. She prepared me for him. She did it without a word, like it was simply part of being a mother. "Go wash," she would say. "Your father will be home soon." I'd obey, because I didn't know what else to do. One night I stayed under the bed instead of getting in. I lay on the floor, curled beside a box of shoes, and held my breath as Giuseppe entered. I watched his feet pause, turn, hesitate, then leave. He didn't check beneath the bed. For a moment, I thought I had won. The next morning, Elena dragged me into the hallway by the arm. "Don't make things harder than they are," she said. She didn't yell. Her voice was flat, worn. "You think hiding under furniture will stop him?" she added, letting go of my wrist. "You think that's clever?" She straightened her blouse and walked away. As if my body were a problem to be managed, not protected. That afternoon I skipped school for the first time. I didn't plan it. I just kept walking past the gates, past the corner tobacco shop, past the stone bridge with its missing balustrade. I ended up by the old olive orchard at the edge of town, where the trees stood in quiet rows like sentinels. I sat beneath one until the sun shifted. For the first time, I let myself cry without swallowing it. I cried for Francesca, wherever she was. I cried for the girl I used to be. And I cried because I was starting to understand something terrible. No one was coming to save me. If there was any saving to be done, I would have to do it myself. That night, I wrote a letter. Not long, not fancy, just a few sentences. I didn't address it. I didn't sign it. I wrote it because I needed to see my truth on paper. Because words, once written, couldn't be unwritten. Because even if no one ever read them, I had spoken. By the time I turned 12. My voice had not yet returned, but my will had begun to stir. It was subtle at first. A shift in how I walked into rooms, the way I stopped avoiding my own reflection in the glass of the pantry door. Small defiance, measured in breaths. I was still afraid of Giuseppe's footsteps, of Eleanor's indifference, but something had begun to fracture in the thick, stale silence I had wrapped around myself like a burial cloth. And the first person who saw it was Professor Lucia. I hadn't meant to leave the letter in my desk. It was a folded scrap I had scrawled on days before in the olive orchard. Just a few trembling lines about the basement. The broom, my sister's vanishing. I had tucked it between my notebook pages, meaning to destroy it when I got home. But I'd been distracted that day. Someone in class had called me a ghost. I'd gone to the bathroom and cried until the final bell rang. When I returned the next morning, it was gone, replaced by silence, and a small envelope tucked into the side pocket of my bag. No name. No note. Just a single line typed on crisp paper. "If you are ready, I am ready to listen." I looked up across the courtyard. Lucia was leaning against the stair rail, sipping coffee from a ceramic cup, pretending not to see me. But her shoulders were a little stiller than usual. She was waiting. I didn't go to her that day. I wasn't ready. But I did something else. I stopped erasing myself. I raised my hand in history class. I offered a quiet thank you when someone passed the salt at lunch. I stopped tucking my hands under the table like they were weapons. It sounds small, but for someone who had spent years apologizing for breathing, it was the beginning of a return. Days passed. Then weeks. Lucia didn't press me, but she kept making space, leaving books on my desk with notes in the margins, bringing in small tarts she claimed were too many from her breakfast, and once placing a pencil case beside me before an exam. It was stitched with blue thread. Old. Worn. Mine had snapped open the day before, spilling its contents onto the floor. I had scrambled to pick it up, cheeks burning, while the others laughed. She didn't say a word when she gave me the case, but her eyes said everything. Then, one Thursday, I found her waiting at the front gate. "Walk with me," she said. I didn't speak. But I followed. We strolled down a quiet lane near the basilica. The bricks beneath our feet were warm from the afternoon sun. Lucia walked slowly, not filling the space with words, just letting it be wide enough for my fear to stretch its legs. Finally, she stopped beneath a wisteria vine, its blossoms beginning to turn brittle in the heat. "I was 14, she said, staring at the petals. I turned to her. "My father," she continued. "He called it devotion, told me I was special, that no one would understand but him." She didn't cry, but her voice thinned. I felt something break in me. Not from pain, but from recognition that someone else had carried the same weight. "I know," I whispered. It was the first word I'd spoken to her in weeks. After that, I began to write again. Not for school. For me. I filled page after page in the notebook she gave me, detailing everything, every bruise, every silent dinner, every time. Elena handed me clean towels with trembling hands and turned away before I could speak. Writing it made it real. But more than that, it made me less alone. I was building something. Not just a record, but a way out. Lucia read everything without flinching. She underlined. She asked questions. She never once told me it was too much. "You're not broken," she said one afternoon. "You were broken into." That's not the same. One evening, I arrived home late from school. I had stayed behind with Lucia, working on an essay, pretending it was about Roman aqueducts, but really using it to stall the walk back to that house. When I entered the kitchen, Elena was standing by the sink, her back stiff. "You're late," she said without turning around. "I had schoolwork," I answered, steady. She turned then slow. Her eyes scanned me like a ledger. "With the teacher?" "Yes." She moved toward me. For a second, I thought she might slap me. But instead, she reached past and gripped my arm, not harshly, but tightly enough to communicate something unspoken. "Be careful," she murmured. It wasn't a threat. It was something colder. A warning wrapped in detachment. "You think someone like her will save you?" Elena said. "They never do." Then she let go. I stood there, the skin on my wrist burning from where her fingers had held me, not with violence, but with something more final. Abandonment. That night, I waited until everyone was asleep. I crept into the kitchen, took the letters I had hidden beneath the loose tile behind the stove, and tucked them into my school satchel. Every page, every drawing, every piece of the truth I had dared to put into ink. I wasn't going to wait any more. The next morning, I handed the satchel to Lucia. "I'm ready," I said. She didn't say anything at first, just held the bag close to her chest. Then she looked at me, really looked, and nodded. "We'll do this together," she said. The day after I handed Lucia the satchel, the air in our house felt different. Still silent, still polished, still wrapped in the false normalcy that held every surface taut, but something had shifted. I felt it in the way Giuseppe glanced at me during breakfast, how Elena poured her coffee with slightly unsteady hands. The rhythm of the house was off by half a beat, like an orchestra playing a piece it didn't quite understand. They knew something was coming, not how or when, but enough to feel its approach like a storm behind the mountains. I kept my head down. I played my part. But inside I was packing. Lucia had made no promises. Only this: "We will get you out safely, but it must be done carefully." She had spoken with someone, Angela, a social worker, a woman who specialized in children's cases. Lucia didn't share all the details, but I could tell from her expression that she trusted her. "We'll need evidence," Lucia said. "Proof. Something undeniable, not just your words." I'd offered the letters, the bruises, Even the details I'd written about Francesca and the money. Lucia had read every page with reverence. But she knew what I already suspected. Words weren't always enough, not when the people you accuse are respected in the community. Not when silence has been part of your family's costume for so long. It's mistaken for virtue. That's when the idea was born. Lucia didn't ask me for anything. Not directly, but I saw it in her eyes when she mentioned what would help the case. A voice recording. Physical proof of the ongoing abuse. Something from inside the house, something only I could get. I was terrified. And yet, for the first time, I wasn't terrified of him. I was terrified of staying, of waking up another day with the broom beside my bed, of finding that I'd turned into the version of myself my mother had become resigned, hollow, capable of smiling while the house rotted from the inside out. I'll do it, I said. Lucia didn't try to talk me out of it. She just reached into her bag and handed me a small recording device. It was no larger than a deck of cards, wrapped in cloth. When you're ready, she said. But never alone. Leave the front door cracked. We'll be waiting outside. The next few days crawled like insects across my skin. I watched Giuseppe with the sharpness of someone studying a predator. His routines were clockwork. Breakfast at 6. Office by 7:30. Home again at 5:40. Cognac at 6. A walk through the garden at 7. Dinner at 8. He never deviated. A man of rules. But I also watched Elena. And I saw something I hadn't noticed before. She was afraid. Not just of him, but of losing what little control she thought she had. She hovered more than usual, lingered in the doorway when I read in the living room. She began folding laundry that didn't need folding. As if by smoothing sheets, she could smooth the cracks in the walls. On the 4th night, the broom returned. It was placed beside my pillow with its usual false gentleness, the bristles still smelling faintly of lemon oil. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't flinch. I reached under my bed and pulled out the recorder. The house was nearly silent by 9-30. Giuseppe single quotes. S steps were heavy on the staircase. He never bothered to mask them anymore. He believed I belonged to him. That my silence was agreement. I set the device beneath the edge of my knitstand, the red light barely visible under the doily. When he entered. I did what I had done so many times before. I obeyed. But I obeyed differently this time. I asked questions. I let him talk, and he did. He spoke with the same certainty he always had, recounting how he taught me properly, how Elena understood her role, how Francesca had been useful before she got soft. Every word carved a path into the tape like a knife. When he left, I locked the door. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat, holding the recorder in my lap like it was a sacred object. By morning, my hands were still trembling. Lucia was already waiting outside the school gate when I arrived, bundled in a scarf and gloves despite the warming season. I pressed the recorder into her hand without a word. Her fingers closed around it. Then she said something I didn't expect. We're ready. That afternoon, everything happened quickly. Angela arrived in a car with government plates and a folder thicker than a priest's Bible. Police followed. Not the uniformed ones, but quiet men and women in plain clothes who knew how to ask questions in ways that didn't scare children. They didn't storm the house. They didn't drag him out in handcuffs. They knocked. Giuseppe answered. And for the first time in my life, I saw him go silent, not angry, not explosive, just silent. He looked from the officers to me, standing behind Lucia. And he knew. He didn't ask me why. He didn't shout. He didn't even try to lie. Because some men, when the mirror is finally held up to them, see clearly enough to know they've already lost. Elena didn't speak either. She sat in the living room, hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on a spot on the rug that wasn't stained until the day everything came out. I passed her once as the officers gathered documents, took photos, recorded statements. Our eyes met. She opened her mouth, but nothing came. Her silence was no longer a shield, it was a tombstone. Angela drove me to her sister's house that evening. A foster home. Temporary, she said, but safe. The woman who answered the door smelled like yeast and rosemary. She wore thick woolen socks and spoke with a gentle accent from the mountains. Her name was Julia. She didn't ask me questions. She just handed me a warm blanket and said, "The guest room has a window that opens to the orchard. The almond trees are blooming." I nodded, unable to speak. As I stepped into the room, I noticed a desk near the window. On it was a notebook. Blank. Waiting. I didn't speak the first 3 days I lived with Julia. She didn't ask me to. She simply set a plate for me at each meal, left my window open during the day so the scent of almond blossoms drifted in, reminded me where to find the extra blankets in case the nights got cold. Her home was quiet, not with the silence of fear, but the kind that felt like being held. Even the floorboards creaked differently, like the house was breathing with me instead of watching me. I'd never been in a place where nothing was expected of me. I didn't know what to do with that. Angela visited on the 4th morning, her coat dotted with rain and a smile soft enough to sit in. She brought coloring pencils, a few new notebooks, and a letter. "From your sister," she said. I stared at the envelope for a long time after she left. My hands didn't move to open it. Just the sight of Francesca's name written in uneven cursive sent a weight through my chest I couldn't name. She had been found in a neighboring province, working under a false name. She'd run away from the man our parents had sold her to, and eventually fallen into the care of a priest who arranged housing and protection for girls like us. She hadn't forgotten me. That's what the letter said. When I finally opened it that evening, hands trembling as the lamp beside the bed flickered, "I wanted to come back for you, Maria," she wrote. "But I was so broken, I didn't even know how to find myself, let alone you. Please forgive me for surviving without you." I didn't cry, not then, but I slept holding the letter like it was a lifeline. In the weeks that followed, I learned to live without whispers crawling under my door at night. Giulia had a kitchen that always smelled of fennel and butter. She wore slippers that flapped when she walked and hummed as she stirred sauce. In her copper pot, she made lists on the back of envelopes and stuck notes to the fridge that said things like, "Be kind to your morning," and "The garden needs patient hands." She was not loud nor motherly in the way stories often portray, but she noticed things. When I woke from a nightmare, she didn't come into the room. She left a cup of warm milk outside my door. When I spent hours at the window instead of doing homework, she didn't ask what I was thinking. She just put a pencil on the desk and said, "Write it down. Then it belongs to the paper, not to you." I started writing again. Not just what had happened, but what hadn't, what I wished someone had said, what I now wanted to become. Lucia visited once briefly. She brought court documents. Giuseppe had been formally charged. The evidence was overwhelming. Elena, it turned out, had signed statements under pressure and eventually confessed to facilitating some of his actions. Though she denied everything about Francesca, neither of them would return to our home. That yellow house, the one with the shuttered windows and lemon trees, had been emptied and sold within a month. When Lucia told me this, I looked at the floor. For a long time. "Do you want to go back?" she asked gently. I shook my head. "I didn't think so," she said. "We didn't talk about them again. Instead, We talked about stories. She asked if I remembered the myth she used to assign us in. Literature class: Persephone, Orpheus, Icarus. I told her I used to pretend I was a girl hidden in those stories, waiting to be found between the lines. She smiled and said, "Maybe now it's time you write your own." Spring became summer. Angela helped arrange an official guardianship, and Julia agreed to keep me. The paperwork took time, but I was safe, and that made waiting bearable. One afternoon in late June, Julia took me into town to a bakery she loved. It was small, nestled between a tailor's shop and a chapel, and filled with the smell of anise and almond flour. The woman behind the counter smiled when she saw Julia and handed me a biscotto without asking for money. "I hear you're a writer," she said. I blinked. Gul, I single quotes s doing. "Try this," the baker said. "Every good story needs something sweet in the middle." It was the first time I laughed without checking who was watching. That night, I sat at the desk in my room with the window open wide. The almond trees outside were heavy with fruit now. The blossoms gone, replaced by green skin just beginning to split. I thought of the house I'd left, of the bed with the broom, of the hallway that didn't echo. I thought of the orchard, of Lucia's pencil case, of the letter from Francesca still folded under my pillow. Then I picked up my pen, and I wrote, "My name is Maria Ferranti, and this is how I got free." I didn't know then what that sentence would become. I didn't know it would one day be published. I didn't know that children would read it and write back. Didn't know that grown women would recognize their own silence in mine. All I knew was that I wasn't scared of my voice anymore, because I had earned it. By the time I was 14, people had stopped referring to me as that girl from the case. I had become Maria, simply and without pity. It happened slowly, through school records, through church rosters, through quiet introductions in Julia's circle of friends. At first, I kept waiting for someone to flinch at my name, to glance sideways with recognition. But no one did, because Julia never introduced me with qualifiers. I wasn't the foster child or the survivor. I was just her. And strangely, that normalcy was what healed me the most. At the summer market in town, Julia bought me my first apron. It was a soft linen green, with wide pockets and hand-stitched edges. She handed it to me without ceremony while we waited for the bread cart to arrive. "You'll need it," she said. "The bakery down the street is looking for someone to help with morning prep. They're willing to train." I looked at the apron, then at her. "But I've never worked before," I said. "You've worked harder than most adults I know," she replied. "I started the following Monday." The bakery was already humming when I arrived. The scent of yeast and sugar thick in the air. The windows fogged from ovens that had been running since before dawn. The owner, Signora Adele, was stern but fair. She didn't ask about my past. "Only if I was willing to learn," I said. Yes, that morning I cracked 24 eggs and sifted nearly a kilo of flour. My arms ached by the time we finished kneading the dough for the first batch of croissants. But my hands, once trained to shrink away, now moved with purpose. They were sticky with butter and flecked with sugar. For the first time, I wasn't cleaning up a mess I didn't make. I was creating something. I went home smelling of warmth, and something inside me, small but certain, began to rise. Over time, Adele taught me more than just recipes. She taught me to be precise, to trust timing, to respect the process. "Dough," she said, "can't be rushed. It needs patience and heat in equal measure. It needs to be punched down and lifted up again. It needs room to expand." I understood that better than most. Sometimes she'd leave a ball of dough in my care and say, "Let it rest," before stepping away. I'd watch the yeast come alive in the bowl, the air inside it blooming. It felt like a miracle. How something so heavy could transform if given the right conditions. So could I saved every lira I earned. Not because I needed anything, but because saving became a way of proving I had a future to prepare for. Every week, I'd put coins in a glass jar I kept beneath my bed. One for the apartment I would one day rent. One for the shoes I'd buy without asking permission. One for the name I would write on my own door frame. Because eventually, I wanted to live on my own. Not because Julia made me feel unwelcome. Quite the opposite. Her home was the first place I'd ever felt safe. But part of healing, I realized, was learning not just how to be sheltered, but how to stand in the world without apology. Angela continued to check in, though her visits became less formal. She stopped bringing documents and started bringing coffee and pastries from shops she thought I might like. "I read your last story," she told me one afternoon as we sat on the front steps. "The one about the girl and the empty closet." I nodded. "She reminds me of you," she said. "But this one ends with her leaving the closet behind." "She outgrew it," I said. Angela smiled. "Exactly." Francesca wrote again. Her second letter came wrapped in brown paper with no return address. Inside, she enclosed a photograph. It was grainy, a little out of focus. But there she was, older now, softer around the edges, standing in front of a bakery in Rome, holding a tray of sfogliatelle. A small sign in the window read "Help Wanted." I ran my fingers over the image, careful not to smudge the ink. She hadn't vanished. She had rebuilt. And though I wasn't ready to reply, I placed the photo in the wooden box where I kept the few objects I considered sacred: Lucia's first note, Julia's cinnamon biscuit recipe, the stub from my first bus ticket bought with my own money. Proof that life could continue. By the time I was 15, the local librarian invited me to join a youth writers' circle. It met once a month in the back room of the library, where the walls were lined with books that smelled of dust and ink and long-forgotten wisdom. Most of the other writers were older than me, university students, apprentices, the occasional aspiring journalist. But I held my own. I shared a story about a girl who learns to grow lemon trees in soil no one believed could hold life. When I finished reading, the room was quiet. Then came a slow clap. Then another. And finally, someone asked, "Is it true?" I answered, "It's mine." They nodded. That was enough. That night, I walked home beneath a sky so clear it looked freshly scrubbed. I wasn't afraid of the shadows anymore. I had nothing left to hide. Names are strange things. You can carry one your whole life and never feel it belongs to you. Not really. You answer when it's called. You sign it at the bottom of your schoolwork. You hear it whispered behind doors or spoken aloud by people who don't see you. And yet, it floats beside you like a borrowed coat. Useful, identifiable, but not quite yours. That's how it had always been with Maria Ferranti, until the day I said it aloud, into a microphone, in front of a room full of strangers, and believed it. It was Lucia who told me about the event. "I've submitted your story to the regional literary youth showcase," she said over the phone one afternoon. Her voice was bright, but edged with something careful. She was never one to assume a yes. "They loved it," she added. "The story about the girl and the lemon tree." I didn't know what to say at first. I looked down at my hands, still streaked with flour from the bakery's morning rush, and tried to picture myself standing at a podium, reading words that once trembled their way from my heart to a blank page. "I wouldn't ask," she continued gently, "if I didn't believe you were ready." Ready. I'd heard that word before. Doctors had used it. Social workers. Even Julia, once or twice, when handing me forms to sign or opportunities to consider. But that day, the word landed differently. Not as an expectation, But as a gift, I took a breath and said, I'll go. The showcase was held in a converted church just outside the city. The pews had been replaced by rows of chairs, the altar now a modest wooden stage. Arched windows caught the last gold of the setting sun, as speakers took their turn, young poets, fiction writers, even a few songwriters. Their voices filled the high ceilings like incense. I waited backstage, my notebook in my lap, heart pacing, faster than my fingers could still. Lucia stood beside me, her hand a quiet presence on my shoulder. She didn't speak. She knew this was not a moment for pep talks. Only space. When the host finally called my name, I felt everything tighten. My throat, my knees, my breath. But I stood. I walked. And for the first time in my life, I took a stage. Not as a symbol, not as a case file, not as a survivor, but as an author. The microphone crackled softly. I opened my notebook and looked out over the crowd. It wasn't enormous. Perhaps 50 people. Some parents, a few teachers, local journalists, and students like me. But it felt like standing before the world. My name is Maria Ferranti, I said. And the sound of it spoken by my own voice made me feel taller than I'd ever been. I wrote this piece 2 years ago, I continued. It's about a girl who learns to grow lemon trees in a place where nothing should grow. I paused, not for drama, but because I needed to feel the silence. Then I read. The story lasted 5 minutes. When I finished, I looked up to see more than one face wet with tears. The applause came slow at first, then fuller like a tide drawing in. I stepped down from the stage, notebook pressed to my chest, and walked back to my seat. No one asked for details. No one asked. Was it true? They simply saw me. And I had let them. Afterward, a woman approached me in the corridor. Mid-40s, hair tied back, eyes lined not from age but from surviving too many long nights. She held a brochure for a local women's shelter. I just wanted to say thank you, she said. I came with my daughter. She's 14. She's been trying to find her voice. I nodded. She looked down, then back up. Your story gave her hope. It gave me hope. I didn't know what to say. So I did something I hadn't done in a long time. Reached out and hugged her. Not because she needed comfort, but because I did. Lucia drove me home. Neither of us spoke for most of the ride. The hum of the road stitching the moment into something quiet and permanent. As we neared the turnoff toward the countryside, I asked her to pull over by the old bridge, the one near the canal, where I'd once stopped as a girl with a paper bag and a fractured will. Stepped out and walked to the railing. The water below glistened with the last edge of daylight, and the breeze smelled of soil and slow-moving reeds. I stood there, watching the reflection of the sky ripple across the surface, and thought about how far I had come. I had once frozen in this very spot. Now, I stood still, not from fear, from awe. Lucia joined me. Do you remember this place? She asked. I nodded. I almost didn't go back that night, I said. But I did, and it led me to you. She smiled. And now look where you've led yourself. That night, back in my room, I opened a new notebook. On the first page I wrote, My name is Maria Ferranti. And today my stories stopped being a secret. Some memories arrive quietly, long after you've stopped waiting for them. They do not knock. They drift in through an open window or slip from a folded page. That's how her voice returned to me, my sisters, not through a phone call or sudden visit, but from the sealed envelope that came in the mail on a Thursday morning. Gul. Aya had placed it on the kitchen table beside my breakfast tea. Rome, she said, glancing at the return address. Same handwriting. I didn't reach for it right away. The envelope sat beside my cup like something living, I looked out the window, where the almond trees had begun to show the first hints of their autumn fade. The season was shifting again. So, was something inside me, after the dishes were washed, and the windows opened to let in the late September breeze. I sat down and read it. Dear Maria, I am still learning how to say things without shame. That was how it began. Francesca's letter wasn't polished or poetic. It was not a confession or an apology, though parts of it wove near those territories. What it was truly was an offering. She wrote about the bakery where she now worked in Trastevere, about the apartment above it with the crooked stovetop and the neighbor who sang arias off-key every night at 8. She spoke of nights when she couldn't sleep and would walk down the cobbled street just to remind herself she was still alive and not invisible. And then, finally, I would like to see you, not to explain, just to be your sister again, if you'll let me. I read those lines again and again. The girl who had once shared a bedroom with me, who had avoided my eyes as I cried in silence, who had vanished without a trace and left me with questions I didn't have the words to ask. She had found a voice of her own, and she was using it to reach back. That evening I went out to the shed behind Julia's house. It was small and smelled of lavender oil and old pine. Inside, I kept a tin box tucked high on a shelf. I hadn't opened it in years. It held things too fragile for the everyday world drawings I made during my first weeks with Julia. Pressed. Petals from almond blossoms I picked during my second spring there. A photograph Lucia had taken of me standing beneath the bakery awning the day I received my final guardianship papers. And in the bottom of the box, a ribbon. Faded blue dot. It had once belonged to Francesca. She used to wear it tied around her braid. In those early years before everything turned. It had fallen beneath our shared bed once, and I had kept it without telling her. Not out of spite or sentimentality, but because it felt like something that still belonged to the girl I remembered her being. That night, I held the ribbon for a long time. Then I wrote back. My letter wasn't long. I didn't recount the horrors. I didn't ask for explanations. I simply wrote, "Yes, I'd like to see you too. Here or there. It doesn't matter." I told her about the bakery job, about Julia's flapping slippers, about how I was thinking of opening a stall of my own one day in the town square. I ended with a line I hadn't planned until I saw the ink move under my hand. I still remember how you used to sing when you thought no one was listening. I remember the way you plaited my hair. You were not lost to me. Weeks passed before she wrote again. And then, one morning in late October, a woman with tightly wound grey curls and a laugh like falling water stepped off the train at Mantova Central. She stood on the platform holding a canvas bag and turning slowly in place, as if unsure where to go next. I watched from the far side of the station, unsure myself whether to approach her as a stranger or someone I'd once known by heart. And then she saw me. Her hand rose, not a wave, just a hesitant, trembling motion, and I crossed the platform. Neither of us cried right away. There was too much space to close. Too many years folded into too many silences. But when we hugged, awkward, stiff at first, then tighter, the kind that makes your spine crack, I felt something inside me settled. Not forgiveness, but the beginning of a bridge. We didn't speak about what had happened. Not that day. Not even that week. Instead, we cooked together, side by side, in Julia's warm kitchen. Francesca peeled apples for a tart while I rolled out the dough. Her fingers moved with ease, familiar with rhythm but slower than I remembered. I burn things sometimes, she admitted, laughing when a bit of crust caught fire in the oven. I forget salt. I offered back. It was enough. She stayed 3 nights. On the 4th morning, before returning to Rome, She left a note on my pillow. "You were always braver than me." I slipped it into my box beside the blue ribbon. I don't believe every wound must be spoken, allowed to be healed. Some are tended in the way we carry water for each other's roots, in how we return without being summoned, in how we build a second version of something we once thought was lost: family, voice, name. Francesca didn't become my savior, but she became my witness. And sometimes, that is more than enough. I didn't go back right away. For years, the yellow house on Via del Voci was just a street name I avoided on mail, a memory I rerouted my footsteps to forget. Even after it was sold and repainted, even after the shutters were replaced and the lemon trees cut down, I refused to walk past it. Not because I was afraid of what was there, but because I wasn't sure who I would be if I saw it again. It was Julia who brought it up one evening, years after Francesca's first visit. We were sipping mint tea on her porch, the twilight thick with the hum of crickets and the scent of rosemary. She didn't ask in the way others might. She simply said, "Sometimes going back isn't about reclaiming a place. It's about freeing yourself from its weight." I didn't respond right away. My fingers traced the rim of the teacup. The heat had long faded, but I held it as if warmth could still be drawn from it. That night, I stood in front of the mirror for a long time, brushing out my hair, then pinning it back again. I thought of the girl who used to flinch at her own reflection, and the woman I had become, someone who had built a name and life of her own from the very silence that once tried to erase her. And I knew it was time. Didn't tell anyone I was going. Not even Francesca. I boarded a morning bus from Mantova's center, a small satchel tucked beneath my coat, and sat by the window, counting the turns in the road as the city slowly gave way to the outskirts. The bus driver didn't glance at me twice. I liked that. I was just another old woman heading to a forgotten corner of the town. When we turned onto Via del Voci, my breath caught not from fear, but from the sudden and jarring familiarity of it. Some things had changed. New paint. A paved sidewalk where once there had only been gravel. The house at the corner had added an awning, but the bones were the same. The yellow house was still there, no longer yellow though. It had been painted a dusky cream, almost beige, as if someone had tried to erase what had once drawn the eye. But I would have known it anywhere. It stood like a memory with windows. The garden, once meticulously kept by my mother, had been transformed. Gone were the white pebbles, the trimmed hedges. In their place stood a small olive tree, thin but alive, its leaves dancing in the early wind. There was a gate, now iron, painted dark green. It was locked. I stood on the sidewalk just beyond it, hands folded in front of me. No one was home. I was grateful. I didn't need conversation. I needed the silence. I walked the length of the sidewalk, stopping in front of the spot where the basement window had once been visible. It was now covered with lattice and trailing ivy, but I remembered its shape, its shadow, the sliver of light that used to slice across the floor when I sat on the cold stone, waiting for it to be over. I stood there for what might have been 10 minutes, maybe 20. The past didn't rise like a ghost or strike like thunder. It simply stood beside me, quiet, acknowledged. I reached into my satchel and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a photo, just one. A picture of Francesca and me from when we were children, taken at a church picnic. We were both wearing white dresses. She had a smear of jam on her cheek. I was squinting into the sun, smiling in a way I wouldn't for years afterward. I had almost thrown the photo away once, but I was glad I hadn't. I folded the envelope and slipped it through the slit in the gate. Not to reclaim anything, but to leave it behind. The wind picked up. I turned and walked away without looking back. On the bus ride home, I didn't cry. I watched the rooftops blur into fields, and the fields into the shimmer of the city's edge. My hands were still, folded neatly in my lap. For the first time in my life, I felt I had left that house on my terms. Not dragged, not exiled, not running just walking away free when I arrived back at Julia's. She was in the garden, pulling up the last of the summer basil. She didn't ask where I'd been. She just looked at me, nodded once and said, "Dinner will be ready in an hour." Later, she handed me a bowl of risotto and poured us both a glass of red wine. "To journeys," she said. I smiled. "To endings," I replied, "and everything that comes after." I slept soundly that night. No dreams of locked doors. No footsteps. In the hall. Just the quiet of a room that belonged only to me, with a window that opened onto almond trees and the hum of a world that, finally, no longer frightened me. I never thought I would be invited to speak in the very town where I once hid my bruises beneath long sleeves. But time does strange things. It can smooth the edges of places once jagged. It can shift people into different shapes. And sometimes, without permission or prediction, it can open doors we assumed were sealed shut. The invitation came in a heavy white envelope. The letterhead: Read Comune di Mantova, Dipartimento per l'Istruzione. At first, I assumed it was a clerical error, perhaps something related to taxes or an old library fine. But inside was a note, handwritten in blue ink. "We are hosting a series of community dialogues on resilience and healing. One of the teachers at Liceo Classico recommended your name. Would you consider sharing your story with our senior students?" I read it twice, then placed it flat on the kitchen table. Across from me, Julia raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "I haven't told that story publicly," I said after a while. "You've lived it," she replied. "Every day. And you've written it, spoken it, taught it, just not in that format. But you've told it." She sipped her tea. "Maybe it's time they heard it. The auditorium hadn't changed much since I was a girl. Wooden folding chairs, pale yellow, walls, the chalkboard on wheels pushed into the corner, the scent of dust, paper, and faintly burnt coffee from the teacher's lounge. I had asked for no fanfare. No long introductions. Just a chair, a table, and a working microphone. When I walked out onto the small stage, the students were quiet. Not out of disinterest, but attention, the sort that feels heavy in the room. Their eyes were wide, their faces alert in that particular way of teenagers who are used to distractions, but sensed something different approaching. I sat down, placed my notes flat before me, and looked out at them. Some faces reminded me of classmates I had once known. Some reminded me of myself. "I want to begin by saying that I am not here to shock you," I said. "I am not here to give you statistics or to scare you with headlines. I'm here to tell you a story." I paused. A true story, my own. I did not describe every horror. I didn't need to. Instead, I told them about a girl who lost her voice, then found it again in the most unexpected places, in a teacher's kindness, in a sister's letter, in the scent of almond trees blooming outside a borrowed window. I spoke of silence, how it can grow like mold in a house, hidden until it begins to rot everything. I spoke of fear, how it disguises itself as obedience. And I spoke of the long road back to selfhood, how healing doesn't arrive in one clean gesture, but in thousands of tiny moments that stitch themselves together into something whole. I saw a girl in the front row wipe her eyes. A boy in the back lowered his head into his hands. When I finished, I expected polite applause. Instead, I was met with stillness. Not the kind born of discomfort, but reverence. Then came the questions. One student asked, "Do you still think about the people who hurt you?" Yes, I said. But they don't define the story anymore. Another asked, how did you learn to forgive them? I paused. I didn't, I answered softly. Forgiveness is not an obligation. It's a possibility. But healing can exist without it. Someone asked if I had regrets. I looked down at my hands, still calm in my lap. I regret not speaking sooner, I said. But I don't blame myself for that. I was a child. And children should not have to be brave just to survive. When it was over, I folded my notes and stood. A teacher approached, pressing a folded paper into my hand. From one of the students, she said. She asked me to pass it on. The note read, "Thank you for telling the truth." I thought I was alone. That night, I returned home and placed the note beside Francesca's letter in the tin box behind the shed. One was from the past, the other from the future. Both were why I had spoken. The next week, I was asked to return not as a guest, but as a mentor. They had created a writing group for students who struggled to speak, for those whose stories lived inside them like coiled thread, waiting for the right hands to unwind it. I called it the Almond Circle. We met every Thursday. There were no grades, no assignments, just pens, silence, and the sacred work of telling the truth. Some students wrote about grief, some about love. Others wrote stories so coded and surreal, you had to squint to see the pain beneath the fantasy. But it was there. And I told them, we write not to relive our stories. We write so we can own them. Some days I arrived early, just to sit in the empty room before the students arrived. I'd brew tea in the faculty lounge and watch the trees outside change through the seasons, first with pale green buds, then full leaves, then bare limbs stretched against the cold. One day, while cleaning out the cupboard, I found a small wooden broom tucked behind the radiator. Old, dusty, forgotten. I stared at it for a long time. Then I took it outside, broke it gently over my knee, and placed the splintered pieces in the compost. The soil would make good things from it.